We are going to get started, even though we had probably some more people will be coming in. Great deal of interest in today's presentation. Carmelo Mesa-Lago is the special guest for this center. He has been a special guest for many years. He has been here a few times. Those of us who have known Carmelo for quite a while fully appreciate the tremendous role he played, and he still plays, as a founding and central of Cuban studies in the U.S. I remember in the late 60s, Carmelo, in the early 70s, Estudios Cubanos?
Yeah.
A newsletter?
71.
71.
The first time I heard the word Cubanologo.
No, don't use that word.
So 1971.
But it was the first time.
There was a very modest newsletter that no one else had done or coined that term in the U.S. He did. And he was the founding Estudios Cubanos.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, Cuban studies. So in a way, he launched it, and he remained central, even though many other voices came to be part of that very dynamic and rich field. And many of you are here today, okay? And many of us who are younger are here also today to join El Profesor Carmelo. So it's really a great joy for us to welcome him. Again, a key role historically and intellectually, academically, institutionally. And he just took time from a tour through Europe. You were promoting your book in Europe and other places.
Right.
The new book, and he very kindly made time to stop by. Voces de Camino, sector no estatal cubano, the Cuban non-state sector. If you're one of the lucky ones, he'll be happy to sign them for you at the end of the session. And again, those of you who did not acquire one copy may do so following your instructions. You know how you can tell them later how to buy them, right? Mm-hmm. So the presentation today is going to be based on this new book. We're presenting first-rate research on Cuba, collaboration between him and a team of specialists in Cuba as well as in the U.S. And it's really a fundamental book to try to make sense of the non-state sector in Cuban society. So I'm not going to say much about that because you're here to listen to him and not to me. Mario González-Corzo, our own Vilner Fellow, and remains very active in areas of Cuban reform in Cuban society. He's going to be following up with a 15-minute or so presentation, complementing what Carmelo will be saying to you. We'll answer period. Carmelo will read afterwards. So Carmelo, really, with a great joy in my heart, I would like to welcome you.
Well, I have been several times here, as Mauricio said, and I remember 5 years ago presenting a previous book. There was a hurricane. New York was without electricity. My wife and I walked here, and nobody's going to be in this place. And there were a lot of people too, so I truly appreciate that you are here today. So let me say first that, as Mauricio said, this is a collective work. I coordinated the project, but the interviews, which probably was the most difficult part of the book, was done by two Cuban social scientists, Roberto Vega and Lenier González. They are respectively the director and under-director of Cuba Posible, which is a think tank, one of the few places in Cuba, together with the Revista Temas, in which people with different point of view discusses freely, but professionally, the main issues dealing with Cuba. We are talking about the non-state sector. A more attractive title would have been the private sector, but it's not private because there are other, there are actually 4 or 5 groups here The first one that we're going to deal with is self-employment. And the second one is usufruct farmers. These are farmers that received a plot of land from the state, which is the owner, remains the owner of the land, and then they can cultivate the land and appropriate the fruits with 10-year contracts that are maybe renewable. And then there are new cooperatives in Cuba. They are called urban cooperative. That means they are not agriculture. They work in non-agricultural services activity, mostly service. And finally, we incorporated also a new group which is quite important, sellers and buyers of private homes. So in the first case, you have private ownership, self-employed. In the second one, is a mixed one, and that is true of the third one, the co-ops. And finally, the fourth one is private. So it's a mixed combination here. And in addition to that, you also have small private farmers. In Cuba, the word private is eliminated. They are called small farmers. That receive about 200,000 of them titles on parcels at the beginning of the revolution. That number has been declining, and the latest figure that I have is 90,000. A lot of work has been done on this group, so we decided not to include them because the others are the really dynamic groups in this reform, which I believe is the most important one that I have on the taking Raúl Castro since 2007. The latest figure that I have about the size of this group, we're talking about around 1.4 million people, and this is 2016, 30% of the labor force. So what you have is a declining state sector in terms of employment and an increasing non-state sector, which is what we are going to discuss here. The impact of this sector is very difficult to assess. There are very few statistics available. Self-employed is the most important one. We are talking about the latest figure, 535,000. And steadily increasing except for a small decline in December of 2015. And this is about 10% of the labor force. However, the only estimate that I have is that they generate 5% of GDP. And you may ask, why have 10% of employment, but 5% of GDP? It is because this group, in which there are 201 activities authorized by the government, is mostly unskilled. Most of the activities are people giving water to workers in the street, taking care of bathrooms in hotels and restaurants. I was with a family at the beginning of this year. There is always a lady with a dish. You have to put some money there, and then she gives you a piece of paper like this that obviously is not enough to dry your hands. There are very few skilled occupations here. We are talking about accountants, real estate agents, insurance agents, translators, so maybe 6 or 7 really. And that's why, because it's such a low on skill group, the contribution to GDP, according to this figure elaborated in Cuba, is so small. Usufruct farmers are the second in size. We are talking about 494,000 with the latest figure. And we cannot really determine what is the contribution to GDP because it's mixed with all the groups in Cuba. They are not disaggregated in the statistics. And then the co-ops partners is a very tiny group. We are talking about 7,700. It's very small, and I will say something about this later. Finally, data on selling and buying of homes, dwellings, is not available. It's collected by the Ministry of Justice. Sometimes once a year or every 2 years they give you a figure, but there is no statistical series reliable, and so I cannot say anything about it. I would say that at least since 2012, maybe 300,000, 400,000 homes have been sold. Okay, so you can see here the decline of the of the state sector, a peak here, and this is figure 2015, the latest one. You get 70% and 30%. And you can see the increase in the number of self-employed here. As you can see, there was actually a decline here. This year, 2010, that's when Raúl Castro announced that there were first 500,000 workers or employees in the state sector that were needed. They were superfluous. They have to be fired because they were very costly. The productivity was extremely low. And after that, the number increased to 1 million. And then finally, for the 2015, the target was 1.8 million people. So that's 36% of the labor force. And the idea was that those who were dismissed from the state sector will find employment in the non-state sector. As you can see, after that, there was this big jump, and then a steady increase in the number of self-employed. We don't have the same statistical data, unfortunately, for the other two groups. Now, before I go into this, this study was based in 80 intensive interviews. Each one took anywhere between 1 hour and a half and 2 hours. The interviewees were not giving any guidance. The question, sometimes when you have, this is not a survey, by the way, we couldn't do a survey in Cuba. We have to ask permission to the Cuban government, and that was impossible. So we decided the only way to do this was with interviews. So we don't claim that this is representative of the universe. However, when I compared all the statistical information and studies available in each of 4 groups, studies, we are fairly confident that the data is important, mostly because it fills a big vacuum of information that there was before. I think it's reliable when you contrast that with information that we have available. And it was done in 2015, mainly the province of Havana, but also Mayabeque and Artemisa, that used to be a couple of years ago part of the Havana province. Now, these interviews have to be tailored to each of the 4 groups because they are different. However, there were 2 very important questions that were asked to all of them, and those I will deal with at the end. So this is what I am going to do essentially. These are the main issues that I am going to discuss, and then at the end there will be the 2 most important questions. So the first one are the characteristics of the group, and this is an important information because the government usually publishes once a year, like 3 lines giving this type of information, nothing as complete as this. And as you can see here, the group is relatively young because they are between 22 and 40, so you get here 58% of the total, and the average is 41. So that's a little younger than the average age for the Cuban population. And the second is gender. As you can see, it's predominantly male, 74 versus 26%. The percentage of females of the labor force is about 37%. So women are underrepresented here. And the second, and this is quite important because no previous data were available on skin color. And we are using the same names as in the census of 2012, which is the latest one. And as you can see, 80% are white compared with 64% in the 2012 census. On the other hand, only 20% are Afro-Cubans, 11% mulatto and 9% black. Quite frankly, I have discussed this with people who are experts on demographics in Cuba. I don't believe that only 35% of the labor force, according to the census, of the population is either black or mulatto. I will say, this is simply visual observation, that perhaps half is non-white. but it is underestimated by the way that the census is done. And then finally, education, and this is not surprising. As you can see, most people have either pre-university or university degree. So altogether, we are talking about 2/3. They are very well trained. So you have the prototype is a young person, a male, white, and very well educated. Now, the first question that we asked was, are you satisfied with what you do and you earn? And as you can see here, it was from 1 to 10. They ranked themselves. We didn't give any instructions. So it's a matter of their own subjective interpretation. So the two highest brackets in the scale are 8 to 10, and you get 80% say that they were satisfied, and only 5% they were not satisfied. Some say we are satisfied with what we do, but not with what we earn. These were anonymous interviews. We didn't register the name of the person. We explained to each one that this was for an academic study. We started actually with the less sensitive questions. As you can see, characteristic, are you satisfied or not? And then the more sensitive questions were left to the end. There were no politics involved in this. We didn't ask, do you like Raúl Castro, rank the Pope, and other international figures? We didn't do that. This was a scientific survey, and we were interested in knowing what the views of these people are. That's the title of the book, Voices of the Non-State Sector in Cuba, because they are really talking in the book. All right, now, another interesting thing is that a lot of them hire employees, and this is quite important because as more employees these people have, easier for the government is to get rid of the surplus labor in the state sector. So as you can see here, 57% hire employees, although the number that they hire is relatively small. See that 36% hire 1 to 5 and 13% 6 to 10. So this is relatively small. It's coherent with the information that we have about the sector. A big surprise was when we asked, do you have a profit? And as you can see here, 35% said we have a profit. 93% said that we have a profit. And out of that 93%, so only 7% didn't have a profit, 35 reinvested all in the micro business. And also, 29% combined investment with consumption. So that's a very high proportion. You can see here that only 22% use the whole thing for consumption purposes. The majority of them reinvested, and if we use self-employed instead of the 4 groups, the percentage is even higher. And most people pay taxes, and you can see here, 95% pay taxes. An interesting issue, this bracket here, that's what they pay. In Cuba, there are 2 currencies. One is called the national peso, which is CUP, and the other one is convertible Cuban peso, and 25 CUP for 1 convertible peso. The convertible peso is not really convertible in the international market. The value is set by the government using rules, discretionary rules. So this amount here, these are the taxes paid, is 2.5 times the average state wage. That's what they are paying. That's not what they are earning. That was very difficult to assess because it was a question, how much do you earn? There were many different ways in which they earn the money. Sometimes it was completely cash, sometimes it was like a share in the business, and therefore we cannot determine that. But this gives you an idea of the amount that these people are earning. And by the way, they pay a lot of taxes, First they have to pay for a license that have to be renewed every year, and then they pay a sales tax. They pay also a tax for Social Security pensions, and there is also another tax which, on my point of view, is counterproductive. It's called the labor force tax. This tax is set according to the employees that these people have. As higher the number of employees, higher the tax bracket. So it's really penalizing those people who are generating employment, and that will help the government to get rid of state labor surplus, but still they are doing this. So if you have more employees, you pay more. And then finally, there are two types of income taxes. One is paid by month, and this is what is dealing here. This is the annual one. And then if you go beyond certain amount, then you pay also an annual tax. So it's a very, it's very heavy, the tax burden that they have. Another interesting thing is, we ask how many years, and this is only for self-employed, how many years it took you to recover your investment in the business. And you can see 29% said less than 1 year, and 18% more than 1 and less than 2. That's quite fast. But we are not talking about a huge amount of capital invested. And most of them are a small business, micro business. These self-employed have a great entrepreneurial spirit, and this is shown in the next table. We ask them, do you have any plan to expand your business? Either you want to move from Havana to other provinces in Cuba, or even you want to go abroad, or you want to hire more employees. And as you can see, 92% says, yes, we want to do that. Actually, we have one, but by the way, I am giving you all this cold data, but the book is completely filled with remarks by the interviewees that give you this voice that I am talking about. I cannot do that because then it would be impossible to do that in 30 minutes. But you are, in each of these cold figures, you are having voices from the non-state sector. Now, a surprise in negative terms is that we ask, are you getting remittances? 65% of Cubans, according to official figures, get remittances from family abroad, in the United States mostly. And only 24% said that they receive remittances. The feeling that we have is that this was a question that was a tricky one, because technically speaking, legally speaking, you cannot have remittances invested in the business. So I think many people didn't want to say, yes, I received this. And by the way, there was a study done by the Kellogg Center with the Cuban study group in 2015, and the figure was 25%. So I think we both are confronting the same problem here. And the second question was, the government gives microloans, either directly or through banks. And as you can see, 100%, that means the 80 interviewees says, we don't want any loans. And the question is why? It's because it's an extremely bureaucratic process. It takes a long time, like 3 instances, and the amount of money that you get, it goes for, in 3 instances, 100 CUP. So the amount is very small, and so people simply doesn't bother to do that. And the final question was if you receive help from family. And it shows that a significant solidarity among Cuban people because 68% said, yes, we do, either from family or friends. And in there, a few people said family who live abroad. So you can see that to this question, they answered positively, and this one, they didn't do that because it was, they were afraid, essentially. The businesses are very competitive. As you can see here, 77% said that there is a lot of competition in the in the business, in these micro businesses. And then another question, important question is, how do you publicize your business? How do you do that? And the large majority, you can see here, all these people here, plus there, this is the most important one, mouse to mouse, the boca a boca, 1/3. And only 19 internet. So this is a rudimentary way of doing. I'm sorry?
The internet is almost non-existent to people, so.
We are talking, the access is difficult and also the price is very high. You are talking about 2.50 CUC, convertible pesos per minute. So this, and you will see that this is an issue that they are taking when I ask them, what are your problems, and what would you like to be improved? So it's a very, remember that this is 19% of 80, okay? So the other ways are flyers posted in the facade of the business, presentation cards, and particularly mouse to mouse. It's very rudimentary. Well, the other thing that you are going to see how important it is in a couple of minutes is how do you get your inputs, the raw materials. Let's say that you have a private restaurant, which in Cuba is called a paladar. Where do you get the materials, the food? You need all the things. You will need a fridge, you need chairs and tables. So how do you get that? And this is a major problem. As you can see, 25% get the things in state shops. The state shops, which in Cuba are called shopping, they sell the goods with a markup, a profit of more than 200%. So it's extremely expensive for them to get these inputs. But so many times, this is the only place where you can get the raw materials that you need. And then the other group, these are cooperatives, mostly agricultural cooperative, but it could be also other cooperatives, like the urban that I mentioned. Only 60% go to the black market. They don't say mercado negro, they say por la izquierda. So if you cannot get this either in a cooperative or por la izquierda, you have to go here. Now, notice this 2% here, this is the wholesale market. The government have been discussing this since 2007. And this will be a market that will have a significant assortment of goods, inputs, at a reasonable price. The problem is that at the time that we were making the interviews, there was only one wholesale market in Cuba. It was at Trigal in Havana. After the interviews were conducted, it was shut down. And then something else was created called Zona Cero or something like that, which is even smaller than El Trigal. And the reason for that there is such a small percentage in what should be the major place to get the inputs is because simply it's not available. It's completely insufficient. Okay, so we arrive now to the two questions that we ask everybody, the 80 interviewees. And the first one, notice we left this to the end because these questions, if we have started the interview asking this, the people may have been nervous. We try to build confidence and trust with the interviewees. It was, are you facing any problems? And 96% acknowledged that they have serious problems. Only 4% said we don't. And what they identify as major problem is exactly what we knew, not in statistical terms, but in terms of information in general. And the first issue is that they have very low access and expensive input because there are no wholesale markets, so you get almost 1/3. And the second one is state bureaucracy, state obstacles and interference, inspectors, sanctions, all these type of things. And this was particularly for buyers and sellers of homes. They were unanimous saying the houses are very expensive for the salary that we earn. So there was a big gap there. Of course, a group complained about internet scarce access, high prices, and then there were other issues. And then the second question, and we find a significant correlation between the previous one and this one, was what major problems do you face? So we asked, which things you would like to improve or change? That was the last question. And it's essentially correlated with the previous one. The only difference is that in the previous question, this was first, and this was second. But you get here half of them. And actually, this also is related to this. Because they are saying, for instance, the members of the cooperative are saying the state have been talking about these co-ops as an experiment. And we have 5 years, I still are in experiments, and some of them are saying, it's time that you end the experiment and recognize us as workers, legitimate workers. And then, of course, the issue of lower taxes, this high income and wages, very important. Again, we want to have better internet access. And there were examples of bribes. They didn't use a word. They said, again, por la izquierda. We gave to sign the escritura, the selling or buy, the compra-venta, or to the register in order to register the property, which is, by the way, the registry was abandoned for 50-some years. And then the government, when passed a law in 2011, realized that it was necessary to revive the registry. And then a lot of people are trying to update or even register the properties that they didn't have in that way. More access to microcredit was an important question. So I am going to end with 4 selected voices. And here you have them. The first one was a self-employed. I say, this is textual, it's my translation. Allow free rein to Cuba's fertile imagination. The government should facilitate and don't obstruct it. Control only what must be controlled. And the second one, this is a cooperative partner. The current way of thinking must be changed, not only among us, but by our leaders. They have to give us more freedom to grow. The third, by a usufruct farmer, the state should give us more support in order to produce more and better. See, these people really want to do their work, but they have so many obstacles, and this is the major problem. Give more opportunity to the peasants. They use the word guajiro. And finally, a home seller. I would like that those who govern think more on how to make life easier to us and less on how to preserve the ideas that have been proved only over penury. The book ends with a series of suggestions, not our suggestions, the interview suggestions, in which they are offering ideas how to improve the situation in which they are. And for me, this is the richest part, but of course, it will take a long time even to make a summary. Thank you very much.
Clarify a point, 7 major questions later, but any short questions geographically, mostly Havana?
Mostly Havana, which used to be part of the Havana province.
Very brief. What proportion of Cubans receive remittances?
65%.
50?
65%. That's the
Short questions, clarification only, some major ones later, Anthony.
Airbnb and Casa Particular?
Yes, that we found was
Those are the
most
self-employed?
the most gainful activity. This is the first one, without doubt. And the second one, Paladares.
Right. And the Casa Particular, they must be the ones using the internet or want to use the internet.
Yes, but also home buyers and sellers. But that used to be in the middle of the Paseo del Prado.
Right.
Now they are using internet, but not everybody have access to internet. Yeah.
Is the government making the same collection of information that you have?
I don't know, because they do conduct an annual survey. We know that because it's the press, you know, the Grandma, for instance, or Ventura Verde says in the latest survey conducted among the percentage was this. But the whole thing is 3 lines in the newspapers. That's all the information they provide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know if when the workers move
Speak up, we cannot hear you.
Do you know if when the workers move to the private sector, do they receive any packages or any short-term kind of monetary help before they just, you know what I mean?
Monetary help, well, I referred to that in the questions about foreign remittances. A very high, small percentage, 24 versus 65% said they do, but I gave the reason why we think it was.
Last question, last clarification, John.
Is the prohibition on using remittances for investment a U.S. prohibition or a
No,
Cuban
it's not a
prohibition?
U.S. provision. After Obama, series of executive orders, you can send to Cuba whatever amount of money you.
So it's a Cuban
It's
prohibition?
a Cuban government that, legally speaking, you cannot do that. It should be for consumption.
We'll have more questions later.
I'd like to thank the Bildner Center for organizing this panel, and I also like to thank Carmelo Mesa-Lago, Professor Mesa-Lago, for accepting our invitation to present his book, or the findings of his book. I was here in the panel in 2012. We were here together when the Hurricane Sandy took place, and I'm glad that we have you back under better circumstances. So I'd like to thank you again for coming. It's not very easy to present a paper after Carmelo Mesa-Lago has presented on any topic related to the Cuban economy, because as we were saying before the session began, he's considered to be one of the founding fathers of the whole area that we sometimes like to call Cuban studies. And sometimes I think I'm a member of that subdiscipline. Sometimes I feel like I should go do something else, write about something else pertaining to my area, which is economics. So I'd like to welcome you all, and again, thank the Bildner Center for putting this together. So the purpose of my presentation, first of all, this presentation is based on a paper that myself and a colleague published in the Journal of Private Enterprise. And the title of our paper was basically looking at private self-employment under market socialism in Cuba, or reform socialism in Cuba. And so it's a good juncture in time to talk about this topic as a follow-up to Carmelo's book. So I'll be very brief. I'll talk about 3 main things, and to sort of put some context to all the data that Carmelo has presented from his book. So we'll talk about what is reform socialism or market socialism. And the premise behind that is the thesis of our paper, which is really that for lack of any better framework, we consider that in many ways, the Cuban economy seems to be functioning under some form of market socialism or reform socialism. Then I'll talk very briefly about self-employment, perhaps as a follow-up to some of the data that Carmelo presented. And then the final objective here is to sort of give a context to self-employment, to contextualize it. So when we talk about reform socialism, in essence, we look at 3 principal structural characteristics, right? So the first one is one that's been repeated in the Cuban media all the time, and it's basically that the state retains ownership of the fundamental means of production. So that's the first structural characteristic. The second one is in relation to the coordination mechanisms, and we have the the fact that bureaucratic or centrally planned coordination remains as a principal way to allocate resources and inputs and in the economy. Although, of course, as we know, and we can observe in the case of Cuba, and I think that's one of the main contributions of the book, is that you have market-oriented mechanisms in some sectors of the economy. Carmelo mentioned cooperatives. He talked about agricultural cooperatives. He also talked about urban co-ops, which are pretty new in Cuba. In Cuba, by the way, the formal name for those is cooperativas no agropecuarias, which, of course, in the economics literature, that's referred to as urban cooperatives. So we have the expansion of the non-state sector. But I think the third feature structural that we have to keep in mind is that the fundamental attributes of the socialist system are preserved. So from the political structure, the Communist Party retains absolute political control, and it will not yield, will not share the platform with any other political entity. Then we have the economic front, right? And when we look at the economic front, well, we have market-based coordination mechanisms. That's really, if you look at self-employment, if you look at usufruct farming in Cuba, you see some of that going on there. And the idea is that those mechanisms will complement centralized planning. And by the way, the objective is not to replace socialism, but to perfect it or to improve the socialist model. The second, which is of course more connected to the book, right? It's the expansion of the private sector from behind the shadows of the state. And the key point that I think came through for me when I read your book and now after your presentation is that the economic actors who join the non-state sector are really motivated by greater autonomy, greater freedom from the state, but also the potential for greater monetary gains. And by the way, the opportunity to use their creativity, their skills, and so forth in a quasi-marketplace. Then we have another feature on the economic front, which is basically the reforms to improve the efficiency of the state enterprises. And if you know about the Cuban experience with this, it dates back to 1997. It's known as perfeccionamiento empresarial, or state enterprise perfectioning, which is really not an English word, but I'm sort of translating. And, well, the Cuban government declares that, according to their own surveys and their own quantification of perfeccionamiento empresarial, 67% of the enterprises that have gone through this process in the last 20 years don't even have reliable accounting systems. So that's how terrible, or perhaps I should say how unsuccessful they've been in implementing this, in meeting this criteria for the economic policies that typically take place under reform socialism. And then we have another one that I found extremely present in every chapter of the book, which is the whole topic of price reforms, tax reforms. A lot of people in Cuba are complaining about, the tax system, and now the property taxes, the tax on labor, the tax on utilization of labor, and so on. So that's another component of the reform of the socialist system. And then, of course, the reduction of, price supports and price subsidies. So in essence, that's a framework that we used in our paper to maybe look at the same topic from a different angle, which is one component of the non-state sector. I think that perhaps we should very quickly remind ourselves that the non-state sector in Cuba has several components, right? So it has cooperatives, which are broken down into agricultural cooperatives, which are the UBPCs, the CCS, the Cooperativas de Crédito y Servicio, the CPAs, the Cooperativas de Producción Agropecuaria, dating back to 1975. Those are declining. Many times I look around the room here and I see many familiar faces who come to our event about agriculture, and the data more or less about the co-ops. Then you have the newly creative cooperativas no agropecuarias, so that fits into one part of the non-state sector. The other component, and I don't have the slide here to show the diagram, which, by the way, it's the first chapter of Carmelo's book, which basically provides a very detailed framework or breakdown, an updated breakdown of the non-state sector. So the other component, of course, are self-employed workers. There's also, by the way, the Cuban government considers people who work in joint ventures also to be employed by the non-state sector, although arguably they're not, because a partner in those joint ventures, the majority partner, is the Cuban government. And so the other component, I sort of regret deleting my slide with the diagram. The other component are the agricultores pequeños, the small farmers, and the usufruct farmers, which are totally different than the independent farmers. So when we talk about the expansion of the state sector in Cuba, it seems obviously based on the official statistics and based on the research that Carmelo and the other researchers did in their book, that the real big elephant in the room, so to speak, is self-employed, the self-employed workers. So here you can see, I went back further to the special period, and you can see the trajectory. Here you can see, not the trajectory yet, here you can see the more recent breakdown of the labor force, right? The breakdown of the labor force, of the Cuban labor force from 2010, which of course is a pivotal point for the structural reforms that have taken place in the Cuban labor market. And by the way, that's probably, I think we can all, I read in the literature, and I think you mentioned it in the book as well, that probably the most profound structural reform so far has been the authorization, the expansion of self-employment in Cuba. You can see that, by the way, looking at this data here, and very briefly, look at the percentage of the labor force that the self-employed workers used to represent back in 2010. Back in 2010, there were around 3% of the labor force. That's more than tripled in 5 years. I only go up as far as 2015 on this table, but the numbers really reveal the story here. So there is an expansion of the non-state sector in terms of employment. There is a reduction of the state sector. But I think that the point is very well taken when in the book you find through the interviews and through the research that you did that they only contribute to 5% of GDP. That is dismal. If you look at the proportion of the labor force, there should be a positive correspondence between that and their contribution to GDP, but it's not. So that's something that I think we have to look at further. Now, here you can see the trajectory of self-employment using all kinds of data that I had here, going from special period to the year 2000 all the way to 2010. So from 1995 to around 2010, the numbers were pretty much stable. Now the statistics are conflated in many ways, so rather than talk about the source of the data, I'm just going to let you look at the trajectory here. Particularly if you look at the delta from 2010 to 2011, that's a 98% jump in self-employment. That is extremely unusual, but obviously it doesn't seem that it's sustainable, that massive delta from 2010 to 2011. And I think earlier on, Carmelo mentioned the fact that there was sort of a flat growth between 2014, 2015, and you can see it there. And so there's a number for 2016 as well. This table, it's old, but I think it's relevant because the table gives you a breakdown of the percentage of self-employed individuals that are young people under 30 and the percentage that are female. And in the context of the literature on reform socialism, obviously, and when you look at the demographics of Cuba, you can see why, self-employment, it's really the driver, right, the principal driver of the expansion of the non-state sector. And what's interesting here, of course, is that if you look at the overall Cuban labor force, the percentage of young people is lower and the percentage of females is higher. So there's a discrepancy between what goes on so far here, what you can see on this table, and what the official statistics show for the Cuban labor force. So then, well, how do we contextualize this whole business, the expansion not only of the non-state sector, but more specifically the expansion of self-employment? I think in the political context, there's a document that was produced last year, which is the Reconceptualization del Modelo Económico, after the Seventh Party Congress back in April of 2016. And it basically says, it recognizes that the non-state sector will exist, right? It recognizes the existence of the non-state sector, recognizes the property forms that are included in the book, cooperatives and private property. What you don't see here is that the document also says that cooperatives will be given priority, preferential treatment over the private sector. So when people talk about privatization and people say, well, capitalism, the government continues to use that political pressure to say, well, here's what our economic conceptualization model says, and we will give priority to cooperatives as opposed to, private enterprises. So it's no surprise whatsoever that yes, there's been growth, expansion, but there's, in recent years, the growth of the self-employment has been pretty small. The other component here is that the role of the government, the role of the state is really to direct the economic planning process, to direct the allocation of inputs and output in the economy. So it still remains a centralized economy, although it recognizes that there will be private ownership of some means of production. Only some means of production, not the economy open all completely. So again, the state will retain ownership and control of the fundamental means of production. So look at the foreign investment law in Cuba, okay, and find a passage that says we're going to open up the foreign investment of individuals, private individuals who want to do business in Cuba, and find it, if you will, because you're not going to find it there explicitly like that. Because the state will retain ownership of the fundamental means of production, sectors like healthcare, education, the armed forces, etc. That's a political context that I think we have to consider when we look at the non-state sector, when we look at self-employment, why is self-employment not growing as fast as it should, what are the constraints. It's all, in a way, implicitly in this conceptualización del modelo económico. Then I thought about, well, what about this mundane entrepreneurship concept, right? This daily exchange economy, which is the Cuban economy. Every time I travel to Cuba, I find what everybody else notices, even the foreigners, even the tourists, notice that it's an economy that's really very active on a daily basis, and it's sort of like the micro exchange economy. Well, this is known as mundane entrepreneurship, not the kind of entrepreneurship that we think about in a developed economy. So the idea is that mundane entrepreneurship, or these entrepreneurial activities, actually arise from daily exchange. Now, even under the classical socialist model, it doesn't have to wait for the country to get to reform socialism or or mixed economy. Even under the classical model, that's how entrepreneurship arose. And in fact, the Cuban government back in 1978 recognized it. And they had reforms in labor, reforms in wages that permitted a very small percentage of private enterprise. Okay. The economy of favor. Socialismo is a term that's been used around for decades. It's nothing new for many people in this room, I hope. The idea that you're operating under an economy of favors, and that creates a crevice that could be penetrated by the entrepreneurial class. But what's interesting is that under this concept of mundane entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurs are actually engaging in what Schumpeter coined the process of creative destruction. And you do begin to see that to some degree in the Cuban economy, particularly after 2010. And they are the catalyst to transform the economy, right? So that's very optimistic. That's very good if you have a positive view of the non-state sector. And I think that the interviews captured in the book, the results of the interviews, reflect the fact that many members of the non-state sector, including, of course, the self-employed, are very optimistic. Carmelo cited a number that I have sort of tattooed in my brain after reading the book and after just listening to you before, which is the 94% that have plans to expand. I mean, this is remarkable under the structural constraints that they have in Cuba. So that's very good. However, the state is reactionary. It fights back. And that's revealed in the interviews. How does the government fight back against, how does it push back the potential tsunami of entrepreneurship, of the expansion of the non-state sector? So one way that it does that, and I'll finish very quickly, it's the sort of the ebb and flow of regulations to control the emerging entrepreneurial class. I read an example of people who have a license to pump the tires of bicycles. As you know, Cuba, particularly after the special period, imported millions of bikes, and there are bikes all over the place and so on. So somebody realized that, hey, I could make money by obtaining a license to pump the air on those bikes. But then the government says, well, if you have that license, you can't fix a flat tire. So that is the ebb and flow of regulations. The number of tables and number of shares in the paladares. I mean, what is the economic reasoning behind it? I assign that, by the way, when I teach international economics in the summer sessions when I get to teach it here at CUNY. I assign that as I tell the students, here's a case study. Find me an economic theory that will justify doing this. And they all get excellent grades because they all say there's none. There isn't any that justifies limiting the number of shares and so on. But look at the other ways the government fights back. Restrictions against property rights and the concentration of wealth. What a wonderful thing to say, we are against the concentration of wealth, and therefore we're going to control the amount of houses, the amount of cars that you could legally own, and so forth and so on. So restrictions on property rights, who can buy, who can sell. Can I buy a farm in Cuba as a person who was born in Cuba but is a US citizen? Absolutely not. And it's not the US embargo, okay? I cannot. I don't have legal title. I may buy it, and I think I said this here many times in other panels, with my brother, my sister who live in Cuba, but I will not have recognized property rights. So that's one way to control the concentration of weight, one way for the reactionary state to fight back. Carmelo mentioned this taxation. I wrote some words here on the way here, burocratismo, papeleo, Cuban word. Papeleo means the amount of paperwork. One thing that caught my attention was the very small percentage of micro-entrepreneurs that applied for government. And the reason was, you said it very well, 300 or 400 cooks, right, or something like that. And then the amount of paperwork makes it worthless, useless. I mean, counterproductive. So that's one way to fight back against the expansion of the state sector. Another way that's pretty scary, if you know anything about business, is this, the experimental character of some of the reforms. The cooperativas no agropecuarias, according to the Cuban government, are an experiment that will be expanded or may be expanded, but nobody knows. So if you are now, and by the way, the book has an excellent chapter on the cooperativas no agropecuarias because it gives you the background in a very succinct way, the background and the two kinds of ways that people can go in creating cooperativas no agropecuarias. Spontaneous or forced by the government. Either way, you're dealing with an experiment. Uncertainty will kill confidence, and it will hinder obviously, any incentive that anybody would have in the right mind to join a cooperativa agropecuaria. We don't have data on how many of them are shutting down. We also, by the way, don't have data about the usufructuarios, right? These farmers who are leasing land from the state. But how many go back to the government and say, please cancel my contract because it's just so difficult to produce that you make it so difficult for me to produce that I'm breaking my back for nothing, okay? So that's one way. Also from, I heard this, I read about this in the book as well, prohibitions about importing and exporting and joining global supply chains. You cannot export, you cannot say, well, I'm gonna create, I tried this, by the way, here in the United States. I had a business. I said, I'm going to export to the Caribbean. Good luck if you cannot join a global supply chain. Nobody knows who you are. You have to peddle your business. You have to go everywhere. And I was peddling to the wrong places. Spent a lot of money. Our business went bankrupt. So joining global supply chains, there is no way that a cuentapropista can join a global supply chain. Forget about that. There are restrictions on getting to economies of scale. Restrictions imposed by who? By the reactionary state. Limitations on foreign investment. Again, I'm interested in business. I like to do business. I love business. I have family in Cuba who are entrepreneurs, but I don't want to go into a business that I don't have legal title on the property. I don't want to have equity on on an entity that's experimental. For that, I buy the real estate investment trust here, which is much better, commercial real estate. In the good, right? The good shopping malls and all that, not the ones that are shutting down. But so limitations on foreign investment, and I don't mean, and please don't tell me, well, there are so many contracts and Spanish companies coming to Cuba to make cheese. I'm speaking of the real foreign investment, community-based foreign investment. People here keep harping about community. Well, here's an opportunity. It's not there. You cannot do it. I cannot do it legally. Finally, the fear of the backlash from the state. It's not there, but it's there. If you have children, little children like I do, you know what I mean. The fear. Well, I don't inspire fear, but my wife does. So they, that fear, well, in the case of the Cuban non-state sector, the fear, I was thinking about what some of the members, the socios, or the members of the Cooperativas No Agropecuarias were saying, this is experimental. We don't know if tomorrow the government is just going to terminate the experiment and they're going to confiscate, they're going to take back whatever's been given to us. So also the uncertainty about license or permit renewals, that's very well captured in the book, by the way. So I'll finish by saying that the fear of the fury of the state, the backlash of the state, hinders the potential development. One final point, the gods are with us today because the Wall Street Journal has a whole section on on private, small companies, entrepreneur, venture capital. There's no such thing as venture capital, legal venture capital, or the whole idea of venture capital. Anybody here try going to Cuba and say, I'm interested in setting up, I run a venture capital company and I want to see what happens. So the model is here. The American economy has a very vibrant venture capital, a very vibrant entrepreneurial system, which, by the way, one key requirement that's missing in Cuba, besides everything that you see here, is that it allows people to fail and to recover. I lived through it here with my own business, and to move on and do something else. So I'm going to, it's weird because I don't have a real conclusion for my paper. I sidetrack here, but these restrictions, that reactionary reaction, that reactionary tendency of the state really hinders the potential of the non-state sector. Thank you very much.
Take 5 minutes,
Well,
and then
yeah,
we'll.
Carmelo wants 5 more minutes. Carmelo?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mario. Mario has done very significant contributions, and he's cited several times in the book, and I think his presentation today was excellent, complementing and extending some of the work that is done. It really is not my book. Once again, it's a collective enterprise. I forgot to say that the processing, the interviews was done by a professor in political science and a research assistant in the same department who are specialists in that area, in which I am not. So it's a collective book. Okay, a few comments. Mario, I agree with all what you said, and as you mentioned, it's in the book, but that really contradicts your first statement, which is that Cuba has a form of market socialism. I don't think you agree with that. I don't think so. Because all the facts that you have presented shows that there is no such a thing. I think Cuba is far away from China and from Vietnam, in which the non-state sector plays a very dynamic role in agriculture, in small manufacturing, etc. That's not the case of Cuba. Cuba is, let me give you an example. I mentioned usufruct. Usufruct, there is a small farmer that receives a piece of land from the state. He has, or she has, he put, because all usufruct farmers in the interviews were men. No, there were no women. It's hard work. But they have 10-year contracts. That means, and by the way, in the first usufruct law, they were banned for building even a house or a stable for the animals. They couldn't do that. The second one, because it didn't work on the first one, it was more flexible. But still, if you have a 10-year contract that can be canceled if you don't comply with your obligations, one of the obligations is to sell part of the crop to the state at a price below the market price. Why I am going to invest? The process of investment is extremely complicated. There are 4 instances to get the approval. Now, you compare that with the experience of China and Vietnam, in which the contracts are either for 50 years or for an indefinite period of time. So the farmer, the small farmer, have trust that the money that he's going to invest in this will be his or hers. That's not the case of Cuba. I have said several times that if Cuba were to follow that model, instead of this business, they could be self-sufficient in about 6 years, following, what happened in those 2 countries. So I am tired of reading articles in the press in which they, about market. This is not market socialism, as Mario very clearly said. First, the state ownership is predominant, the plan is predominant over the market. And there are a lot of regulations and zigzags in policy, which make it extremely difficult for these people, despite their desire to expand and to do that business. It is very difficult to do it. And finally, this is the worst of all. After Obama went to Cuba and met with a group of emprendedores, self-employed, and in the speech that he gave in Cuba, mentioned the importance of this group for the economy of Cuba, there has been a backlash. Nothing has happened, really. Nothing has happened after Fidel died. So we have to wait until February 24, maybe. I don't know. I think it will be difficult. But so far, I am not so optimistic about this unless something happens. And of course, under our President Trump, he's going to push back in terms of the steps that were done by Obama, which I think were right. And that will have negative repercussions inside of the non-state secretary in Cuba. Okay, so we are open for questions.
I think it's inevitable that 50% of Cuba's GDP will come out of vacation and recreational tourism. Europe's dangerous. Puerto Rico's bankrupt. Mexico has antagonism towards us. It has safety and beauty. That will be constant. Nothing's going to stop safety and beauty. So eventually, it will raise all boats. I haven't heard anyone talk about it.
No.
It has to become.
No.
It has to.
Yes, Samuel, 3 questions, then yeah.
Muchas gracias, Carmelo. 2 clarifications of fact. One of them is 30% of the labor force is private, but you refer to 10% of the labor force producing 5% of the GDP. That's one question of clarification. On the question of race, I completely agree with you that it's not 64%. However, do you happen to know how was that defined in the 2012 census? Was it self-identification, or it was the enumerator defining who was black, mulatto, and white?
One last question on this front. Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about self-employment, it implies that these are entrepreneurs, but in fact they are not. The vast majority are not entrepreneurs. To work in a paradero, for example, you cannot have more than 5 employees, I think. So if you exceed that, each individual who works in that has to get a license to work in the PUD. So the entrepreneurship portion of the self-employment is actually very tiny. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. The issue of tourism is dealt with in the book. I mean, the book have I don't know how many tables and graphs and analysis of this and the questions. Yes, you are right. I mean, the two important three beneficiaries of the booming tourism in Cuba are bed and breakfast, which are people who are renting homes or apartments. The second are paladares, and the third one are transportation. Now, I am going to give you my personal experience. I went to Cuba with my family, my daughters, sons-in-law, grandchildren, at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. Just to confirm what you are saying. We have been in 2011, and we were lodged in the Cohiba Hotel. It's probably the second one in Cuba. At the time, a room for two cost $150, or CUC, more or less. That hotel now is charging $600.
American dollars?
Yes,
American
yes.
dollars.
For how many days?
Per day.
One night.
If you try to book a trip to Cuba for 1 week, it's going to cost you $5,000. Now, we didn't go to the state hotel, but that's a state hotel. We went to a mansion in Miramar, we were 10, that cost us $5,400. That's 40% the rate of the Cohiba Hotel. Parque Central is more than $700 per day. So, right, the private sector is benefiting from this. And I mentioned that this was the occupation that was more profitable in Cuba. But this is so expensive, even in the private sector, that how many people are going to return? Another problem that I noticed is comparing 2011 and 2016, 17, is, well, everybody knows that the state restaurants are awful. By the way, I read, I can't remember now, I think it was an article in the magazine of the, No, it was in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was there about, Cuba, and he was saying that one of the best places to eat was El Templete, which is in the Malecón, very close to the old city. We were there in 2011, and it was managed privately. This was an idea of Eusebio Leal, which is the historian of the city, that reconstructed a good part of the old town. And he was fantastic. We came back, now it's a state-owned, and we couldn't eat the stuff that they gave us. Plus, it took 2 hours and a half. Another problem, the quality of the paladares is not the same. We went to several private paladares, small restaurants, to test this. We not only went to state restaurants, but we also went to the private one that we have before. The quality is not the same. And also, you have group of American tourists, mostly because they are Europeans. Once the group comes, 20, 38 people, those who are small are given second chance. They attend, they care for the big group. Just an example, because this is very important, the personal experience. I am not saying that this is universal, but it's my experience. We wanted to take the grandchildren to the 9 o'clock cannonball, because that's a really interesting thing in Havana. And you have to be there at 8:30. We went to one paladar, private, at 6:30, in order to have enough time. You know how long it took after a group of 30 foreign tourists were there 3 hours. Of course, we couldn't go to the cannonball. So what I am saying is that, yes, you are right, but this is not, panacea. There are problems. Cuba doesn't have the structure, the physical structure. They don't have entertainment. I mean, a tourist doesn't only go to see Havana or go to Varadero. They want all the things. One van with air conditioning, $250 per day plus tip. So now the second question.
Second question, a little bit more efficiently because we want to have more time for more questions.
No. Yeah, I wanted to give a personal experience because I was giving only numbers, and that's not. So 30% is not private. 30% is non-state sector, Samuel. So you have there the non-agricultural cooperative, the usufruct, everything. So that's not only self-employed. Self-employed is about 11% of the labor force. The 5% figure, I don't believe it. Quite frankly, this is done by a Cuban economist. He didn't show how he did the calculation. And this is a very important issue. We agree on that because the importance of the sector is not only measured by the percentage of the labor force, but the contribution to GDP. And this is almost impossible to do because the government doesn't provide minimum information that you can then process and reach a conclusion. The 2012 census, the census taker decided what was the color of the skin of the interview. As you know,
self-identification.
Yeah, yeah. The interviewer was deciding by visual who was black and who was white. In Cuba, it's not the same criteria as in the United States, in which people can be black, Afro-descendant for several generations. Even it looks like a white person or a very clear skinned person. That's why I believe that this is totally underestimating the size of the Afro-Cubans. And then the final.
That is a big issue that we'll have to address at some seminar focus on how race is measured. That's a separate issue, though.
Yes, I do agree that they are not really entrepreneurs. We have one case out of 80 in our interviews of a self-employed business in which actually there was an article, I think it was in Grama or in Juventud Rebelde, one of the two. This is a guy that is producing spices, processing spices, and also dry goods. And he had a significant number of employees, but he was also saying all the problems that he was facing precisely because he was successful. Very interestingly is that many restaurant Baladar owners told me, we don't want to show how successful we are, because then, you are noticeable. And then that means you're going to get inspections, you're going to get restrictions, etc. Okay, so.
No, but I wanted to follow up on that question about entrepreneurship, but I think, Carmelo, the market, the term, reform and market socialism, what we're pointing to is those inner contradictions that in some way, right, the Cuban economy, for example, if you look at the allocation of output, let's say clothing, it's no longer centrally allocated as it used to be under the classical model, but the state retains, the ownership of the factories, the majority of the factories and all that, and the retail outlets and all that. If you look at the coordination of economic activity, once you have a non-state sector growing, some coordination takes place outside the central plant. So in that sense, it's getting closer to a mixed economy. But when you were pointing that out, it reminded me of I'm into cars and I bought an old Chevy Caprice and I couldn't get it out of second gear, right? And that's where the Cuban economy, and I couldn't get the car into second gear actually because the whole gearbox was all banged up. And I realized after I bought the car, lucky me, we have lemon laws in New Jersey, thank God. But I think that it's stuck right now in a gear where, you know, the incipient non-state sector, it's allowed to do a little bit coordination here and there, but yes, I agree, it remains for the most part. And by the way, the Cuban leadership goes out and says it very explicitly, we will remain a central planned command economy. So that's a very useful point that you gave an excellent example, which is usufruct farming and the limited.
Gracias, Mario. ¿Tienes algo más?
Una bien breve, la pregunta de los emprendedores. Yeah, not, and Carmelo answered that too, not in your traditional sense, entrepreneurs who can have access to venture capital and things like that. But at the moment you break away from employment in the state sector, even if you're working for somebody else and you have some leeway in negotiating your compensation, I think the self-perception is that you are also an emprendedor. Although you are getting, let's say you're working in some clothing, in a little private clothing store in Havana, you're getting paid by sales, commission. So still, we're stuck in first gear, right? The car's not going far, not going far. So.
Okay, we have to, let's take a few more questions. By the way, I'd like to remind you that, caramba, da un chance aquí. This seminar today is an extension of something we have been doing for 21 years. In 1996, Marilu was there, I think yeah, he was there too. Who was there? I don't know. We formed the Cuba seminar. Samuel, you were there too? Yeah, you were.
Thanks, man.
At the Old Rat Center. So this is now not 2017, so it's 21 years. So we want to give ourselves a round of applause for holding. I want to thank Kennedy. You want to?
What about congratulations for getting past the experimental stage?
I understand.
We want to also make an announcement. What some people call fake news, filter news, filtrations. John has some filtrations and fake news, or as Cubans might call it, Radio Bemba, on what's happening in Washington. John, you want to be very brief?
Come to the front so we can hear it. Yeah.
Very, very brief. This is again thumbs up on what President Trump is likely to say, allegedly, rain of salt tomorrow. Again, this is fake news. This is fake news.
Well, there's already there have been stories for the last week saying that there's a dramatic rollback going to happen in travel and other economic relationships with Cuba. Politico today, just before I got here, ran what it says is the draft or a summary of the draft document. Now, I'm not sure from what they say that that draft document has actually been approved by President Trump, and there are actually factors within the immediate Trump entourage which work against the more restrictive policies. But even assuming that this is what is going to be announced tomorrow at 1 o'clock in Miami at a building that has symbolic importance for the Bay of Pigs contingent. And the things that you can say from looking at this summary is that it may not amount to a lot more than symbolism. It seems that the most immediate impact will be that we won't be able to stay in state hotels. The target of the language, which is inspired by Rubio and Mario Diaz-Balart, is the Cuban military holding company Gaesa, which, according to some experts, is about 80% of the tourism industry. I don't know that that's true, but that's what Cavalish says. And he's the most frequent source in the media. But that's the hotels. I don't know whether it's the buses.
All the buses.
But it's not Amis Tour, which is a party institution under ECAP. It's not San Cristobal, which is under the historian's office. It's not Havana Tour, which is under the Ministry of Tourism. None of those are the Army. Now, if those companies can continue to function, they're going to have to find a solution to hotels and find a solution to transportation. But just say some things that are not prohibited. There's no limitation on independently organized travel, going on your own, staying in a bed and breakfast. There's no limitation on remittances, no limitation on Cuban Americans. In other words, the things that really count and where the growth sector is for Americans are not touched by this. It's the going after the symbolism of Gaesa. There's also some stuff about people who have a larger range of government positions won't be able to have bank accounts in the U.S., which means their wives will have bank accounts in the U.S. I mean, it's mostly silliness that was meant to give some kind of symbolic payoff to Miami. But
the very bad named men who do very much behind the issue, the toughening up, did not prevail.
I think that Rubio and Diaz-Balart are going to claim a great victory, but the more you get into the actual analysis of it, the less
John, thanks so
they've
much.
actually
We'll go
gotten.
back to this issue later. We hope we have time for a few more questions, and we want to be very brief and to the point in both in the questions and the answers. Yes.
I have a question, not a comment.
You have a question? Go ahead.
I got a little bit confused with your numbers. In 2010, the Cuban government said it was going to fire a certain number of people that had to be absorbed by the state sector. So did they get fired and did they get absorbed?
All right, that's one question. Ken.
Mario's slide that's still on here refers to the state control of the emerging entrepreneurial class. And the question is, and I may know the answer inferring from what you said, is there a class of entrepreneurs, or is it just that there are a bunch of individual entrepreneurs, and would the state allow them to be a class?
Yes.
Do you suppose that with the growth of the non-state sector, there will be pressure to alter the public school system, the school system, and we would see some other forms like the return to some private schools?
By the way, we want to go back to the question raised by John's comments later, but let's answer these three questions. One of the questions I want to make time for is the issue of U.S.-Cuban relations. And let me take an opportunity to announce the recent publication of a book edited by Margaret Crahan, who is here at Columbia University, and Soraya Castro Mariño, Cuba-U.S. Relations, Normalization, and the Challenges. So, congratulations, Meg.
It's available for free on the internet.
Oh, wow.
All right. Again, we will hope to have a brief discussion as to what the
There was a
impact.
question.
I know.
That man over there asked a question and he couldn't finish. So I would like to know what the question
But we take three questions at a time. No, you're the boss. You want four.
It's actually connected to the first question.
Go ahead, Anthony.
So I wanted to go back to the original purpose for all of this, right, which you said, as I understood it, was they needed to cut down on the number of state employees. What happens to the people? I mean, it seemed odd that there were 500,000 let go, 500,000 who became self-employed. What happens to people who don't become self-employed? Is there unemployment for them? And is there some plan, does the government plan to go and cut even more?
Good question. Yeah.
Okay. So this is both key important questions. According to official figures, they have dismissed a little more than 500,000 people. That was the first target, but it was not the final target of 1.8 million by 2015. So, and then in the seven-party Congress, April of 2016, they said no more dismissals. So the problem is that you have in Cuba a very low percentage of declared open unemployment, but you have a huge amount of hidden unemployment. And I figure that we are talking about maybe 18%. Using those numbers that the government wanted to dismiss, they were still there. The major problem here, if you dismiss all these people, you have to give them a job, because there is a small unemployment indemnization, which is like 1 or 2 salaries, and that's about it. And that would have created a socio-political problem. They were not able to dismiss 1.3 million because of all the structures that the state created. Okay, Mario, te dejo la pregunta sobre the entrepreneurial class. Public education and healthcare, no way. In the guidelines, it was specifically both of them excluded from any possibility of private interference or insertion. And I doubt that that will happen. So, Mario?
Yeah. So, no, thank you for the question. I was hoping that nobody would notice the term entrepreneurial class, but you did, so you were paying attention. I think yes. So the answer is based on this. Typically, when you think of a class, social class, in this context, we can judge it by the type of housing that they have access to. We can look at their consumption patterns in relation to other people who are not part of that group. We can look at their displays of wealth. Very careful displays of wealth in Cuba, because Carmelo mentioned before that some of the self-employed micro entrepreneurs or emprendedores were careful not to display too much wealth. But some people do. Some people are more risk, and by the way, another category would be risk-taking behavior and risk aversion. And you see that difference between the entrepreneurial class and the rest of the population in those 4 categories. The kind of housing, the consumption patterns, what they can afford to buy, and so on, their displays of wealth, and their propensity to engage in risk-averse behavior. So I would argue that based on that, there is an emerging, entrepreneurial class.
Any more comments? Mario, no. That's fine. Okay. We'll take 3 more questions if there are any. Yes.
Hi. Thanks for your wonderful talk. There's a new book coming out on the Cuba 1%. Do you know about this? Who do you think they are? Perhaps you could describe how the Cuba 1%
Oh, yes. El 1% de la, el 1% de la sociedad cubana, como la clase del 1%. Oh.
John, una pregunta que John Alamo.
Okay, are there any signs of their ability to unify the 2 currencies? Has there been any progress at all at the level of the government, because you've got those 2 pesos and cooks?
When you had your hand up, you had your hand up? You were just scratching your neck. Yes, Peter.
I wonder if there can be some reflection done about the black economy, and also the percentage that the military takes on joint capital ventures. How are both of those, how's that capital invested? Is it invested abroad, in consumption, or where is this amount of capital? Where is it floating? And how does it, what's worthy of investment, given that its origin is really black?
Well, we did 4 questions before. Let's do 4 now. Yes, sir.
Yes, in terms.
Speak up, please. You're way ahead.
In terms of loans or credits to the Cuban economy or to the U.S. exporter, Is there anything that I don't know? But still, the embargo applies to all these issues.
For the next round, we'll deal with the U.S.-Cuba relations and what's likely to happen. Let's take those comments so far. Then we'll go back
Can I
to that.
respond to the first one? I would venture to say that the Cuban 1% is probably affiliated to the military, right? And they're the state controls the fundamental means of production. And somebody asked before, somewhere around there, about tourism, right? And the importance of tourism, and now we're talking about potential changes in US policy. So I think that's what the answer is gonna be. I don't think it's gonna be with the cuentapropistas or people who are micro entrepreneurs, although I would continue to say that, yeah, there is an emerging entrepreneurial class. But without the same dimensions that we have here in Silicon Valley, right? No venture capital and so on. Currency unification, very briefly, nothing new that I'm aware of. No new announcement. Se está estudiando. It's being studied. It's being studied. And then I'll defer everything else to my co-presenter, to Carmelo here.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Mario. The Gaviota and the whole state capturing of the whole hotel travel business is probably what you are referring to. We don't have the figures to do that because a lot of people who are connected with the government have also restaurants that appear to be private, but are really the operation of some important figure in the government. But we don't have that kind of is not Polish. Okay, now on the unification, Cuba have to unify the two currencies. This is a major problem. We have been talking about this for 10 years now. I mean, it began in 2007, and we are in 2017. And there have been a lot of articles published on this. Probably the most important also is Clavel Vidal Alejandro, who I think is the best monetary economist. He's not in Cuba, he's now in Colombia, but he travels back and forth. Raúl announced that it will be this year. There has been a resolution 2 or 3 years ago, in which, by the way, extremely complicated. You have simple equations in it that set the rules for that. In my opinion, it will be extremely difficult because the budget for this year, 2017, projects 12% fiscal deficit. And that means that the government is going to increase CUP is a collection, and there will be a significant inflation. But the whole process of unification by itself creates inflation. And I don't see how, under these circumstances, and also the problem of the supplies and help from Venezuela, they will be able to do that. I am afraid to make predictions on Cuba. I have been burned several times, but I think it will be very difficult to do that. And then capital ventures. Well, I think the question was here, right? I mentioned to you how the use of the self-employed reinvest. But there are tremendous limitations. For instance, let's say that you have a very successful paladar in Cuba, La Guarida, which is in this article, by the way. You cannot have a second Guarida. You cannot have a chain of La Guarida. You can only have one. That's it. So the limitations are tremendous. And also, there is a process of capital accumulation among some people in the particularly self-employed, but you cannot reinvest all that because there are limitations in terms of in what are you going to invest. Now that will create conspicuous consumption, which is one point that you are there, but you have to be very careful not showing it too much because then you will call attention to yourself. And you are talking about loans for private. Yes, I show you that I cannot remember exactly. I think it was 100% of the people that were asked the question, 80 interviewees, says that they don't have and they don't intend to request that because of the small amount and the tremendous bureaucracy in order to get that sum. And finally, on the embargo. Let me first say that I was the first probably Cuban American that publicly expressed against the U.S. embargo. And that was in 1965 in Miami. And believe me, I lost most of my friends. So I am in favor of lifting the embargo. I am in favor of the steps that Obama took. I think that this policy was intended to overthrow the Cuban government, and the Cuban government and the Castro are still there. So don't tell me that this has been effective. This is ridiculous. You have to try something else. But the embargo today, it's not what it was 20 years ago. And then there was a major problem because Cuba have relations with more than commercial relations with more than 100 countries. And there is trade and there is investment. By the way, the investment process is very slow, not because of the embargo, but because the Cuban government is taking a long time to approve proposals for investment. As last month, there were more than 400 proposals, and the Cuban government have proposed 21. And about half of those already were in Cuba, and it was an approval for expansion or going into another kind of business connected with the previous one. So why they need $2.5 billion of foreign investment annually, but they are going so slow that they are never going to go get what they need unless they change the policy and accelerate the process.
Carmelo, then let me pose two broad questions and then we'll take whatever questions you have and that'll be the end of our session today. A number of years ago, you and your fellow economists, many of them Cuban Americans, pioneered a wonderful exercise which was critique of various reasons, nevertheless made a lot of sense in hindsight, which is that the Cuban policymakers tend to reform, and there's a pendulum swing back from reform period to orthodoxy. And you had various theories, various notions as to Fidel ideology, this and that, charisma, etc. In the light of that wonderful literature, we hope to review at some point, Mario and Carmelo, right? Maybe we can review that, those approaches to Cuban economic history of the last 50 years. But given the crossroads in which Cuba finds itself today, reform, all the criticisms you want, but still, as you showed yourself, a lot of growth, reform, cuenta provistas, foreign investment, tourism, the dollar circulates, etc. Are we likely to see a pendulum? It sounds improbable that we will see a pendulum back to 2.0, in which there will be an emphasis on orthodoxy again. So I personally, I don't see how the government, and I'm now talking about Cubans themselves, the internal forces. I don't see how that thing can swing back at this point in time to the way, the reactions that it had before. So that's, the first question is, broad questions to end this session with. Do you see, Mario and Carmelo, the forces in Cuban society, in the Cuban regime, the younger faces in the regime, the older ones that are surviving, the balance of all that? Do you see elements for, if not deepening, and you already addressed that issue, some continuation?
Yep.
And then the second question is in the light of John's comments about the U.S. and the Trump administration, assuming that something like that is roughly true, that is to say that whatever changes are announced tomorrow will be symbolic right? Pretty much what you said, right? If that is true, how will that impact on the expansion of, or continuation of the deepening, if you will, of the reform process in Cuba?
Yeah, I was the author of the theory of the cycles in the Cuban economy, moving from pragmatist cycles in which there was some move timid towards the market, and then ideological cycles in which there was a move away from the market. I don't have any idea that under the August we have been in a pragmatist cycle. The problem is that this cycle...
The ideologue all time are gone?
Oh no, ideology is quite present in Cuba. There is no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean that the features of this cycle are ideological. I mean, we don't have tried to create a new man and have equality, equal. On the contrary, there's a phenomenon in equality and equal in Cuba now. But this is a pragmatist cycle because all this, the self-employed, the use of fruit, all these are forms that try to approximate very slowly to the market. But the problem is that I see this cycle like stagnant, particularly since Obama visit to Cuba, which Obama visit have a very positive impact in the population, but it created a panic in the leadership. A panic in the leadership, no doubt about it. On your second question, as I said, I don't want to do predictions, particularly 24-hour predictions. But even if you are right in what you're saying, this is not only symbolism. Let's think in terms of what you said. The government of the United States will allow only American tourists to be lodged in bed and breakfast, in private places. Immediately, the government of Cuba is going to do something about that. That will be counterproductive. That will be counterproductive. I don't think that this is only ideology. I mean, whatever this guy says tomorrow is not going to be good. That's my view.
So Mauricio always likes to conclude our sessions with this question about continuity versus change. On the Cuban side, I say wait until 2018 and see if Raul fulfills the promise. And then what happens after that, because all of us are just putting pieces in the puzzle together. So my sense is wait to see what happens on the political front in 2018 in Cuba, that is. In terms of the impact of the any changes in U.S. policy measures, I agree with Carmelo that the reactionary state, I think it's there still, it's going to fight back. And it's not going to fight back by saying, okay, well, let's, one of our principal sources of income, one question that we missed from here was, somebody wanted to know if we had any notion of what percentage, what is the reinvestment rate of military enterprises in Cuba? No, I mean, I don't claim to know. So you could imagine how the reactionary state will react, will respond to a change in policy that will impact a source of revenue to their critical, tourism operations and all that. I think it's going to impact U.S.-Cuba relations, but I also say we have to wait and see. We have to wait and see.
I know, there's a follow-up question on the Cuban-American front. The wealthy Cuban Americans in Florida and elsewhere, what do they have to say about Cuba, reforms in Cuba? Van Hool wanted opening, right? The Van Hools. Or Rodriguez also wanted to see some change, and many others. Should we believe the stereotype that it says that Cuban Americans are monolithically opposed to change in Cuba? Or can we begin to entertain notions that it's not only academics like you and us and many others, but also business people really want change?
Florida International University have been conducting every 2 years a census among Cuban Americans in southern Florida. And that experiment shows through the years that an increasing number of Cuban Americans are in favor of traveling to Cuba, having a relation to Cuba, against embargo. And the last census, the last survey, you have a majority. There was against stratification, however. As younger you were, more in favor of relations with Cuba. As older, you were more in favor of embargo and no relations. I mean, the old Cubans are dying. I mean, I am going to die too, no, maybe 2 or 3 years, but I am not in that group. So, but as they die, and you have a new generation, that trend is going to not only to be confirmed, but to accelerate. So I don't think there is a monolithic in the the only thing that I cannot explain is why these Cuban Americans like Marco Rubio, Díaz Valar, Curbelo, etc., are elected. I mean, I cannot understand it because they don't represent the majority of Cuban Americans in South Florida.
Very good.
They don't vote, the majority.
Mario, you want to add anything?
No.
Yeah, I think, for years and years, we overexposed the impact and the size and the clout of the Cuban community. Don't forget that demographically, we're not even 2% of the population of the US. Yes, there's a lot of influence and political influence and all that, but yeah, so it's becoming more diverse. But I think I see a big question mark as a response to your question. I think everybody's waiting to see what happens after 2018 with Raul Castro. Will he really leave power? Who's the successor of Raul Castro? You ask around this room, and all of us have a different theory, a different name, a different idea, but do we really know?
Can I say something about that? Very briefly.
Absolutely.
The person who supposedly will become the president of the Council of State, the Council of Ministers, is Miguel Díaz-Canel. Okay. We don't have an idea how this guy thinks. At the beginning of his role, he made some positive comments about the need to have more freedom of the press and more access to internet. And after that, practically nothing. The only power that this guy has is the armed forces and the party. And in my opinion, and that's a prediction, Raul will continue to be the first secretary of the party. But Raul is going to be 86 next year. 86. And if he was not able to do the reform, at least the most important step of the reform, what chances Díaz-Canel has, even if he had the support of Raul and the armed forces and the party to do it? I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. Again, it's the prevalence of political logic over economic logic. And that have been the constant under the Cuban Revolution.
So economists don't have an answer for that political question.
That's right.
So listen, thank you again, Carmelo Mesa-Lago. What a great speaker.